Podcast. I've got Meta Prime with me today, and there's a number of things I want to talk about, but I think we're just going to wing it because there's so much overlap. He's been on a bunch of other shows. I'm sure a lot of you have listened to his stuff. So what's up, man? Thanks for coming.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I appreciate you being flexible on the time at the beginning. I had a little run in during my workout. There's a basketball court right next to my thing, and there's in the apartment building that we have, and there's some people that keep using the apartment gym that should not be in there. And so I had a little bit of a confrontation earlier that extended my workout a little bit past
Wow.
what I was expecting to. So yeah,
You had
but
a
it's
confrontation with them or with the staff who should be not allowing them in there?
well, the staff has gone home. You know,
Oh,
it's late, right? It's
yeah.
it's like 7 or 8 o'clock ish. But the last time I did this, the staff did over here, and they came down and they thanked me. They were like, at first I was like really worried because this woman comes down. She looked like she be on some sort of HR team, and she was going to scold me. And she's like, "Did you tell that guy off? If he wasn't, in the building, he didn't belong here, that you should leave." And I was like, "Yeah." She's like, "Thank you so much. We have so much problems with these people coming in
Oh
and
my gosh.
using the facilities who don't live here." And
Who are these
so,
people? I mean, I assume they're,
uh,
CNN scholars is what's happening. Yeah.
yeah. It's unfortunate. There's just like people nearby who, and it's the same thing with our pool during the summer. There's just people think that they can come in and use it, and no one calls them out because everyone's really nice. Everyone
Yeah. I,
wants to get along and everything like that. But
I don't want to make it entirely a race thing, but I think it is a race thing only because if a white person was doing that, people would socially be allowed to kick them out. And I'm sure they are.
mhm.
But it's like only black people are allowed to do that. Or, certain, like an Asian couldn't get away with it, but maybe a Dominican could. Maybe not a Puerto Rican, but a Dominican. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um,
Well, they did throw that card at me. I was like, if you guys don't live here, you got to leave. And he was like, this is because you're white or something. And I was just like, oh man, I don't know if you want to make it about race, man. I'm just trying to get you out of here if you don't belong here. But we
yeah.
we can make it about race if you
And
want.
if you called the cops for them trespassing, it would of course be like, oh, you're gonna kill them, that type of thing. Because
Yeah.
yeah. I mean
So
that's
so
a
I
yeah.
appreciate you being flexible on the time is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean that's a great reason. If you had told me that, I would have, driven down there and helped you. Um, all right, so at the beginning, let's get out. Like you have your Substack. What do you want to promote, just so everyone knows they have it in the back of their head? We'll talk about it again, but
Yeah. So I think like I can both I can piggyback on that question to tell your listeners a little bit about myself, give a little bit of an intro, and then because I think that's very important context for understanding my own content. So um, I grew up fairly liberal, Northeast white family, white middle class family,
yeah. Did
and
you play lacrosse?
if you're a I actually rode, road crew. So,
That's
it's
even more so.
similarly
Okay.
waspy kind of sport. Yeah, for sure.
I asked because I
Um,
did play lacrosse and I have a similarly
yeah,
New Eastern upbringing like that. But sorry, continue.
yeah. No, I did. For a few years, I played lacrosse. I played long stick defender. So that was a good time.
That's probably the most
Um,
Chad position as well.
yeah, it's fun, especially if you're tall and then you also have the long stick. You really have a lot of reach. So, but yeah, so a lot of millennials, I think, didn't really pay too much attention to politics. I was like into like punk rock, like anti-war stuff, and that was about the extent of it. But 2016 was a big eye opener for me. It was the first time I started to actually like focus and like watch the news. And I think as soon as you start paying attention, if you kind of have a discerning eye and you're kind of willing to ask questions, the narrative starts to fall apart. And so I've come to call this the mainstream delusion. The cracks in the mainstream delusion become more and more evident. And then eventually you just get to a point where the cognitive dissonance is impossible to maintain and the whole facade breaks. And then you're in this really difficult place of, well, what is true? Right. If I can't believe the mainstream narrative, I can't believe, what these different institutions tell me, what the government is doing for us, then where do I put my trust? And so that was a very difficult thing for me to grapple with, especially considering the people around me were very much immersed in the mainstream delusion themselves. And so, the reaction a lot of people had was, you're crazy. And so either I was crazy or they were crazy. And either of those situations, doesn't feel like a good situation to be in. But eventually found my way out of that. I also went from a very atheistic position to having some very interesting, spiritual experiences that really brought me around to believing in divinity and God, whatever name you want to give it. And that path was also filled with a lot of like friction and difficulty. And so when I got on Twitter, around 2020 during the pandemic, I think a lot of people got online because, we didn't really have anything better to do. We were stuck in our houses. Um, I realized really quickly that in our online sphere, there's a lot of people coming there to find other people like themselves, to have interesting discussions, to have that support network, to talk about ideas. But there wasn't like an orientation guide, right? There wasn't a, hey, it's great that you've woke into this mainstream delusion and that you're breaking free from that. But what is the ideal that you should strive towards, right? What is a proper framework or mindset to have going into this? I don't think it's very well defined in our space. There's pieces of it, right, that we talk about, lifting weights and eating healthy, and being okay with self improvement, self powerment, being okay with being proud of who you are. All of these things have elements to that, but no one had kind of put together a cohesive guide and laid out the steps and talked about it in a very kind of structured way. And so that's where I found my niche. That's where I started writing. I often say that when people wake up, they tend to find themselves living in opposition to evil as opposed to pursuit of good. And that's a very core part of my message, trying to make it so that you're not defining yourself by what you're against solely, but defining yourself what you're for, building towards that. And so I have this section on my website. It's called The Journey. It's broken down into 5 steps. It's awakening, framework building, self improvement, creation, and then world improvement. And so a big part of that is, how do you walk that journey? How do you go through those steps? How do you make yourself a better person, and then use that better person, be able to make the world around you a better place? And so I think giving people some sense of how to orient themselves, how to drive themselves forward. That's how we win, right? Is we empower the people around us. I think that's exactly what you're trying to do, what a lot of other people are trying to do in the space, and that's just my contribution to it.
That's awesome. And anybody who's been listening for a while to this podcast knows that that is awesome to me. So I can't put that into words because there's a lot you said, but no, that's fantastic. Okay, yeah, I didn't realize I hadn't seen that. Is that on? You said your website or your Substack, or is that the same thing?
Yeah, so I need to do a better job of organizing it and putting it out there. I mean, this is one of the downsides of Twitter, is I don't think it's very well structured to lay out kind of evergreen stuff, right? Like, you're constantly trying to put up like new threads or zingers or whatever it is. Like, it's very, the timeline speed, the turnover speed on Twitter is very quick.
Yeah.
And so my thought on building the website was I could have a much more structured evergreen philosophy that was kind of laid out. People could use that to find what they need. And then everyone also has a Substack. That's where the podcast is hosted. Also, if anyone wants to support what I'm doing, I do appreciate a paid subscriber. So having that, and then I am like considering maybe I should put my podcast out on more than just Substack, like Spotify and such
I
like
think
that.
you should.
But
yeah.
Yeah.
Especially if it's free. I mean, if it's already being put out for free on Substack, at least the free ones, definitely you should put them out. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a few that the only reason that anything lives behind the paywall is if it gets a little spicy.
Got it.
And
Yeah,
so
I do the
there's
same
a
thing.
few that
Yeah.
there's a few that live behind the paywall, but for the most part, a lot of that information, I want it to be readily available to people. That's the point. So they share practical information. And so
Yeah.
the vast majority of it is free.
I had to put up on my Patreon, which is $2 a month. Shout out. Yeah, I'm doing a $2 a month Patreon until I build a wealth of until I build enough where I'm like, okay, like $5. But everyone who gets in is grandfathered in at $2 forever.
Nice.
Yeah. But I had a 22-minute conversation. What I cut it down to 22 minutes with Basil, Neobactrian, who like we talked about the Decepticon question, and can't put that on YouTube. So yeah, stuff like that lives behind the paywall. Some other things.
Sounds good. I'll have to check it out. I do think Basil has some good takes. So
Yeah, he's a real interesting guy. I like him a lot. I really do. We talk every
Yeah.
couple days, to be honest. He's fantastic.
Awesome.
Yeah, and he came on my other show, 5 till midnight, with the libertarian guys that we do, where I mostly just screw around and sometimes role play as a liberal and yeah, that type of stuff. Um, all right, man. So one thing. Oh, is there anything more you want to say?
I mean, that's really it,
Yeah.
is trying to build a guide for people as they kind of go through that process of awakening, of orienting themselves effectively. A big thing that I say is you have to become a master of both worlds, kind of stealing from the Campbell's hero journey there. You have to have one foot in the mainstream delusion, one foot in the parallel movement. And that's what our guys need to be doing is they need to, instead of tearing down the system, although there are certain ways that you can go about attacking it effectively, we need to be building alternative things and be part of this parallel movement. And so again, I think what a lot of people in this space are doing, yourself included, building education networks, communication networks that are parallel, and then from that I think we're starting to see a lot of businesses, fraternity groups, all of these kinds of things are kind of springing from the network and the relationships that are being built, and it's a really exciting time.
Yeah.
When I was talking to the Prudentialist in my, like, I think it's like the ninth episode of my podcast, we talked a lot about how 2024 is definitely the year to build.
Dude,
So
I mean,
it's
I
exciting.
can feel it. It's like it's hard to
Mm,
tell. I know a lot of people listening to this aren't going to be aware of all the stuff going on behind the scenes, but a lot of the guys that listen to Illegitimate Scholar, they also listen to a lot of other shows. I mean, I know because I can
mm,
see what else they listen to, and I know that you guys
sure.
know these other people.
Mm.
Jay Burden, Prudentialist, freaking, it still stays on. I forgot I had to do it. It's fine. I'm here. Yeah,
Mm.
no, it definitely is. And right now you're getting on the ground floor with the premier cultural anthropologist of the dissident right. That's me. There's no one else like me. I am a special snowflake.
Awesome.
That being
Yeah,
said,
I
yeah.
always jokingly say we're like Primarchs. I don't know if you're a 40K lore fan, but the whole idea of the Primarchs is they all grew up on these very radically different worlds.
Hmm.
One was like a slave, like gladiatorial arena place. Another one was like a hellish wasteland. They had one that was like like a very well run, functioning aristocratic like society, and so they had all these Primarchs that kind of became the best versions of those worlds. And then the Emperor of Mankind goes on this crusade and unites all the Primarchs. And I think that's kind of what's happening now is you had a lot of people who they did their own thing and they kind of built up, they became the best of that area, that discipline, kind of embody that philosophy. They become effectively the avatars of those areas. And now we're just gathering them together and forming a nice big coalition.
Yeah, yeah, it is really it's really happening in a big way. It's very exciting. I'm very excited
Mm,
about it, being a part of it. And it's awesome. And this is how we win, and this is how we're going to keep winning,
mm,
especially as the situation becomes like to guys like us and a lot of people that listen. It's obviously going down in a very big way, and it's going to change people's perception. And I had
mm.
talked to Bog Beef and Marbleck on my show a little while ago, and I think Bog Beef asked me the question of like how you know when there's a shift in like understanding, because for me a lot of the stuff that happens, there's momentum of beliefs in like humankind and in human culture. So there's the momentum of these beliefs with people like my dad is a like George Bush Republican who then in the naturally after that he was like, okay, now I like Obama. Like he was like Bush, McCain, Obama. Like that's where it
Hmm.
went, and now he's a vote blue no matter who. Like Biden conservative. Like I mean, and you can call
Hmm.
that whatever you want, but he's a Biden conservative. He's this Richard Spencer contemporaneous, like NATO first type of guy. And
Interesting.
that type of there's a lot of people like that. There's a lot of people who believe
Mm,
in these through what I believe to be momentum. They believe in the world of the past and how things were organized. They're not as dialed
mm.
in with what's happening currently and how these ideas
Yeah.
are expanding currently. And the biggest thing for me right now is number one, the spiritual element of the war going on in the Middle East, which is huge. I mean, I've barely seen anybody talk about the red heifer ceremony, but the people at the
Right.
top, like that's what they care about. This is like
Mhm.
The Bohemian Grove type of people, they care about spirituality, so we need to care about spirituality. We know they care about spirituality because of the ceremonies and the rituals they use. It's not all nonsense. Which is my value proposition as somebody who's a cultural anthropologist, and 3% of cultural of anthropology is not like left wing Democrat type stuff.
Yeah.
And that is to say that there's certain things happening right now, and a big example that I can go into detail on this later, but because I go into it all the time, the Illegitimate of Papua New Guinea. It's an often cited on my show. I actually promote this book so much that it now costs $40 on Amazon, because all the lower copies got sold out, because it's like
Mm.
it's a niche cultural anthropologist book written by a real cultural anthropologist, like not like me, but like a PhD, who
Sure, sure.
did ethnography in Papua New Guinea, and they saw the destruction of this men's cult, which is it was the power in the community. And as the
Mhm.
Christian missionaries move in, basically the cult gets destroyed. The cult gets destroyed, but the cult doesn't get destroyed until they still have the cult, and then they have Christian missionaries for like a decade or two. And
Mhm.
society is different, but there are these guys holding on with this momentum to this cult. But what ends up happening, and I don't know if this makes sense because I don't know if I gave enough detail, but what ends up happening is after a long time, there are five guys, five like, 30s guys who stand on stage in the middle of a church service, and they tell
Mm.
everybody about all the secrets of the cult, which involved the cult, like, which is just the men in the society. It's like an old boys
Mhm.
club in Papua New Guinea, which would go out and they would kill women and children sometimes and terrorize them. Yeah, it was this whole thing.
Okay.
It was like they had
Yep.
a temple, and like once every few months or months, the guys would get together and drink their version of drugs and hang out and have like a guys party, and then as a method of social control, sometimes they're killing women and children. And this is from an
Mm.
ethnographer's point of view, so I don't know how common that is. I don't really know how they did it, but that's the thing that they were doing.
Mhm.
But these five guys get on stage and they blow the lid on the whole thing. They tell everybody this is what's going on, and then the secrets are out. And at that point,
Mhm.
everything that had been going on in the shadows behind, all these new people who were growing up in this new world now, they're being acculturated in the society that has this old style men's cult, which no longer makes sense in the world where they're interacting with Christian missionaries. They have some modern technology. It changes the way that they interact with the world. And then while the cult is still functioning, it still functions for a while. And then there's one event, and that event happens. And then after that, Pandora's box has been opened, and you can't put it back in. There's nothing you can do
Mm.
now. It's destroyed, and then there's this new reality. So
Mm.
I feel like 9/11 is one of these situations where it's like, there are momentums of belief, and then there's specific punctuating events that happen which completely change the paradigm of how everybody is viewing everything. So when 9/11
Mm.
happens, there's like these dormant traits almost that people have. 9/11 happens, big events happen, and then they get activated in a certain way where now the situation is different, and then it's almost like plate tectonics moving and then jerking movement and then jerking movement. You know what I'm talking about?
Mm.
I'm
Yeah,
talking.
yeah,
I don't know if you do know what I'm talking about because I'm being extraordinarily up in the clouds right
yeah.
now. But
No, no, no. But
yeah,
it's one of those things where it's like, what's that? That it's like a T.S. Eliot book or something like that, and they're talking about bankruptcy, and he's like, "How did it happen?" And he's like, "Well, at first gradually, but then suddenly all at once."
yeah, gradually and then suddenly all at once. Yeah. So there's. I
Mm.
mean, it's building under the surface, and you know, an event could be like the financial collapse because one of the other things that I
Which is
do.
coming.
What's that?
Which is coming.
Right, and the other thing that I do is finance. So that I mean that's what
Mm.
my background is. I barely talk about
Oh,
this.
we could have a very long conversation about finance and what's happening in Europe and the fact that the euro dollar is going to collapse in the next 2 to 3 months. And yeah, so if you want to get into that, we can get into that.
Yeah, no, we can. I mean, if you want to do it right now, we can do it right now. But or is there anything else you wanted to say because I was talking for a long time?
No, no. I mean, I was there's a lot of things you were touching on there with the spiritual side of things. I think I'm also very familiar with So I believe in what I call meta spirituality, or if you're familiar with the perennial philosophy, it's basically the idea that all religions are different interpretations of the same thing.
Yeah.
There's better interpretations than others, right? You capture some knowledge better than others, and it's also sometimes often adapted to the people who are using it, like any tool.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that is very lacking in our modern world is an appreciation for the spiritual. And so this does become a big part of my content, especially when talking to people about how to live their lives and live them in a way that's going to be meaningful. Is you have to reincorporate an understanding of the divine. I'm not prescriptive in how people do that. I think I love our Christian bros as much as our pagan bros, but for me, an appreciation and understanding of the spiritual is important. And especially for guys like us who are talking more broadly and looking at the greater movements, if you have an understanding of what like agregores are and how, consciousness affects matter and all of these kinds of things, you're going to have a much more accurate understanding of what needs to be done, how people need to think, and how things work.
Yeah, I don't know what those things are. So you said
Agregore.
agregore. What is that? Sounds like a demogorgon.
So an agregore is basically like, um, so all right, here's an easy way to explain this idea. So you know how when you meet people, we call them NPCs, right? People who have all the same ideas, right? And I forget exactly who was it? It might have been Campbell who said, "People don't have ideas; ideas have people," right? And this is a very real phenomenon, right? Basically, and you have that idea of like people don't have an internal monologue and stuff like that, right?
Terrifying, dude. Scares the crap out of
Yeah.
me. I don't want to share a country with anybody who doesn't have an internal dialogue.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a crazy thing. This is, and that's like a whole nother topic we could get into, where I definitely always encourage people, like, we live in a world where everyone is encouraged to think of everyone else as exactly the same. It's just situational differences that led us all to where we are. Where obviously there's certainly differences in quality between individual people, and often different types of people from different areas and stuff like that. But as far as what an egregore is, or so you probably edit this kind of jumbly part out, but the point that I'm driving towards here is that um, the difference between people who have an inner monologue and don't, right, are people who are much more proactive and intentional about using their creative spark as a human being versus those who are largely controlled by these, and you can call them egregores, you can call them ideas, right? It's that idea that people are possessed by an ideology, right? It's like there's many ways you can think about this, right? But you say like an NPC, right? The NPC meme where they get updated with the new chip, right? And that chip is like, all right, now we're first we were you know COVID fascists, and now we're like, now we're supporting, the new thing. We're defending Ukraine, and now we're defending, Israel, or whatever it is, right? It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Um, but the idea is that these people, they don't think for themselves. They simply like adopt the code that is handed out by the mainstream media, right? They become possessed by the ideology, and so one of the ways you can think about this, if you think of it on a meta level, is they're no longer individual beings. They are simply extensions of a larger thing. And that's what that larger thing is. It's called an egregore. And so, when we battle against woke ideology, we're battling against the woke egregore, right?
Yeah.
And and this I think helps in some regards. Like when I run into people who think like this, I don't think I'm fighting that specific person. I think that person is generally trying to be a good person. They're
Yeah.
just consumed or possessed by this idea, and it's like, how do you perform an exorcism almost, like how
Right.
do you disentangle them from that idea, dispossess them from that idea? And you have to be very careful, because that has many defense mechanisms, right? If you say the wrong thing, it's going to trigger them into friend foe distinction, right? And so you have to
Right.
slowly extract them, partially by getting them to awaken their consciousness and to question and to think and to reflect, but also representing something that they could be that is different, that they want to aspire to.
Yeah. So this is really interesting. So, in the anthropology of religion, which is specifically what I mostly do a lot of the time when I'm doing something academic. And
Mhm.
also, this relates to a piece that I'm writing right now to submit to the Dissonant Review on propaganda. So it's almost like an operating system, right? It's like
Yep.
there's a term in the anthropology of religion called a cosmology, and a cosmology in the context of religion refers to the set of ideas that form how human beings view the world. And a lot of times, and what people aren't willing to admit is that humans learn through metaphor a lot. Humans learn through
Mm.
these great epics that we have, like Beowulf, these foundational texts, and sometimes, you know, they form the underlying philosophy of how we not not only like what information we have, but how we interpret that information. So it's actually the most important thing to me. I remember to bring up bog beef again.
Mm.
Bog beef said to me, and this is probably the only time I've ever disagreed with something that bog beef said, is that bog beef said to me, like, were fighting. I don't remember the context, but people are fighting over something stupid, like how to interpret and he said like some stupid religious distinction between people, and I said, like, well, what do you mean? Those are the only things that you should fight about, because like these
Yeah.
distinctions with how you view the world are
Mm.
they're the real things worth fighting for. The other things you're worth fighting for, what are
Mm.
you fighting for? This geographical location, 2 extra points on a GDP. You're gonna die for Zionism. Like, what are you dying for? What are you doing? You're gonna die for
Mm.
globo homo. But really, you are going to die for globo homo, because
Mm.
that's what NATO does. And I can say this because I'm a veteran,
Sure.
but NATO, like, they expand for the expansion of neoliberal democracy. That's what they do.
Sure. Yeah.
So uh, that is to say that, like, these foundational beliefs, they change the way that information is inputted into people. So
Yes.
when you look at different religions, different religious beliefs, I don't have it ready to be pulled up, but there is several polls that cover the differences in religious beliefs of different religions. So there are these different
Mm.
religions that have different religious beliefs, and one of the most striking ones to me is that those that are agnostic or atheist at a macro level perspective, which is all of what I talk about. I only talk about macro level stuff, and I think you're very similar.
Yep.
Is that at a macro level, which is the only thing that's important, you can find an atheist that's more conservative than I am. But at the same time, they might be an atheist like Genghis Khan. So who
Mm.
knows? But they're atheists in general. Like, they support abortion at like 83%. They support they support the state. They support all these, regardless of how you feel about those things. They're there are beliefs that you can see on the back end of those belief systems that you have on the front end, and in using those polls you can display it in a way that the local college student who thinks that the pinnacle of academia is going to Harvard and learning about the 72 different genders that they have. But yeah, so the underlying beliefs, underlying cosmologies, underlying philosophies, when those get changed, I mean, it's almost a decentralized way of having individual people to propagate and expand your own beliefs. So,
Mhm.
and this is why education and religion are things that are controlled so much by people who want to retain power.
Yes. Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. There's if you create a certain way for people, it's like a lens. They view the world through their ideology as a lens. They interpret everything that happens that way. And the thing that kind of came to mind as you were talking there is I think part of the reason that so many people fall into the buckets that they do is actually a distinction between whether they are like a high T alpha male or they're a sigma male versus like the rest of the population. And I'll explain this a little bit. So there's
There
this
is
great
data to
poll meme.
support differences in political beliefs based on testosterone, by the way.
Yeah, yeah. And there's this great poll meme that, it's like anytime someone like somehow captures like an idea super well on poll, it inevitably gets screenshotted and then shared through the internet, and
Yeah.
people will bring it up in arguments. And this is
You're
one of
talking
those
about
memes
4chan
where,
poll, by the way, for the listeners, right?
yes,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And the point that the guy makes is when you are like a high T male, or if you're like a Sigma male, you're not thinking about truth or ideas. When you encounter ideas, you're not thinking about whether you're thinking about, is this true or not? And if it's true, then I should adopt it. And if it's not, I should throw it out. If you're someone who's kind of low T and you're beholden to the social network, you're not able to kind of stand on your own. You have to get along, right? You're part of the herd. The way that you interpret new information is not whether it's true or not. It's, if I believe this, how will the people around me think? Right? How will they think of me? Right?
Right.
And that, in my mind, is exactly why you get such a like common ideology throughout the masses, is because they feel it's very much dependent on their social network. It's a social contagion thing. And that's why you get that aggregore thing, is like as it kind of spreads through the network, it's contagious. It pushes people. There's a social thing too. So if you're thinking about it at a macro or a meta level, right, you can kind of see it, and you're talking to an individual person, but they are an extension of this wider ideology, this social pressure that's pushing them all in these directions. And that's why when you talk to people, the NPC idea is, the analogy is perfect, because it's like you have an NPC who has a a conversation tree, and if you ask this question, it's going to lead to this answer. And as soon as you map out one part of the tree, you're like, I know what the rest of your tree looks like. I know who you are as a person. Like, you're completely possessed by this set of code, this ideology. And you're right. In order to get these people to change, it takes such a fundamental shift in their ideology and their philosophy and the way that they see the world. And it's very difficult. And I think I was talking to a good mutual of mine on Twitter earlier today in a space, and we were talking about this. And I think we are reaching a very big sorting period, where you're effectively going to just push each person like more and more towards a side. And that side is either going to be exploration and flourishing and vitalism, and the other side is that Nietzschean last man, just like go along with the herd. But you're basically sterilizing yourself. You're basically like wasting away on the couch and becoming like like plugged into the matrix, right? You've got the VR goggles, you've got the heroin IV drip, and you've got the the jack off masturbator just forever strapped on. Like you're in the pod.
What do you mean? Those are all the things I need to live a happy life. What are you talking about? That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Let's do that.
Dude, so I get invited on these AI spaces every once in a while, and it's hilarious because I don't know if they understand yet that I'm like who I am and like how I see about the world. So I try to keep my power level relatively hidden. But every once in a while, these guys will go off about how awesome it's going to be when you can just like fully insert yourself into the matrix and just like play video games all day and just like be high on drugs like intravenously. And I'm just like I try to like gently push back. I'm just like, you realize you're basically like euthanizing yourself in like a dream, and that's not real. And like it's amazing. It's amazing to the degree to which people don't understand how important it is to like engage with the natural world, and like how much you're kind of like completely scorning like the gift you've been given, to experience that.
Dude,
So
that's really happening, because that sounds like the plot of a dystopian movie. Like, I think there's
yeah, you would think,
movies
yeah,
about that.
yeah, you would think you'd just be able to say like, "Have you read Brave New World?"
Oh my
Like,
gosh.
you know that book? But
I could have told you that
yeah,
was a dumb idea when I was 14 years old. That's the kicker. Jeez, man.
yeah. I mean, to be fair, there was a point in my life where I was like, I want to live forever, like hooked up into the Matrix and just playing like World of Warcraft style like video games with my friends. Like that does sound fun, until you realize like real life is far more interesting and nuanced and like meaningful. And then you're like, oh yeah, because I think that's the problem that a lot of people have, is they don't feel like they have agency in the real world. They don't feel like they can kind of be involved and do anything meaningful. They're not told that that they're constantly oriented towards like stars, like movie stars and TV stars, and like music celebrities and all this kind of stuff, and they think that is like the pinnacle of life. That's what like a good life is. And what they fail to realize is it's much more like, I'm not 100% on board with the stoic idea of like world, but I think it is much more about an individual experience. It's like, how do you grapple with life and the questions, and like who really sees you is God, is the divine, right? And that's really what's gonna, like, you have this relationship with that, and like it's your story, right? Like the story, like if you're, the way I explain this to people is, if you were playing a D&D game, you're like your soul, or like your higher consciousness self is like playing who you are in the real world as a character in the D&D game, and like God is your DM, right? And your goal when you play D&D is not to like become the king of all the land and have all the riches and get all the babes and do all that kind of stuff. It's to create a good story and have fun and be, interested and live towards the higher ideals. Like, be a character that is inspiring and in like you're excited about, right? And I think that that's kind of lost on a lot of people is, they think that because they're not a movie star or whatever it is, like they should just drown themselves in like, base pleasures, and they completely miss the opportunity to create a beautiful life story, which I think is kind of the highest aspiration to have.
Yeah. Yeah, it sucks. And so this is so I had this conversation with a friend of mine, my best
Mm,
friend actually, about like, I'm like, he was talking to me about, and I don't get into my personal life too much, but like
sure.
calling me like successful financially and in these other ways. But it's like,
Mm,
I was like, the stuff I do on the side, I'm not saying I'm like super rich, but it's not really hard as a millennial, as a 29-year-old, a younger millennial or a Zoomer, to be, it's not uncommon to be higher than other people, in the sense that like everybody's in a pretty bad spot. Over like, on a macro level, our generations are in a bad spot. So
mm,
like, I have had financial success. I've had issues in other parts of my life, of course, but like, I was running a business when I was like 14, 15 years old, obsessed with making money, obsessed with these types of business things,
sure.
learning about these things, reading hundreds of books, like listening to podcasts and all this stuff that I do um for self-growth. And like, and yes, okay, so I own a house at 29 and I get to travel around and my life is great. I enjoy it, but you can't, like, you shouldn't have to be crazy to live like half of the life that I live. Like, you should be able to work a normal job as you used to in the past. You should be able to work a normal job, be able to buy a house and have kids. And frankly, to me, and one data point to show on this is, there are polls. I love polls. I don't talk about them too much, but like polls, census polls, because they can show these macroeconomic or macro trends, macroeconomic, and like the behavioral economics sense of human behavior. And like, people become more conservative when they have kids. People's beliefs change when they have kids. And people also at the margins, at these areas where they're deciding what life choices to make, the decisions that they make are based on the how easy everything is available to them. So 70 years ago, when you could get a job at a grocery store and you could have kids and own a house, that's great. A lot of people are going to do that. But now, if you work at the grocery store, you can barely move out of your parents' house if you live in Connecticut. You might be able to if you live in Pennsylvania, but you're living a poor life. It
Yeah.
sucks. It's hard to support children. It's hard to have that stability. You might not even be able to move out with your girlfriend, like with how high rents are. I mean, it's insane. So, like, in human nature, humans are prone to look for the path of least resistance. And if the path of least resistance, if it makes sense for you to get a simple job, which should be fine, like these jobs that people are doing, if 70 years ago, when we had much less technology, why was someone able to do that job and afford it then? Why can't they now? And the answer is complex, because it's this giant web of billions of people in an economic system, and it's not simple to fix. But the fact is that in theory, that's insane that we're much more efficient economically now, and yet our system of distribution is not allowing for a lot of people, Zoomers and millennials namely, to live the lives that their parents lived. And like, that's not to say that from a whiny left wing, like, oh, we have it worse than our parents. It's to say
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
no, this is a practical thing. It's like, in practicality, the vast majority of people are going to go with the path of least resistance. So create a society that gives people a path of least resistance that leads them in the right direction. And we're doing the opposite of that.
Yeah.
Not we, but the greater zeitgeist. No one's in control of
Yes.
this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's social
Yeah, yeah.
constructions run amok. They're doing
Yep.
their own thing, and people are just along for the ride. And right now, they're looting the carcass of a once great nation. Is what's happening.
And I agree with you. I think that we are in a very tough filter right now where it's very hard to see a path to having a family and raising kids. And the traditional thing of, sending them to college seems just so unattainable for so many people. And I think that it's a demoralization, right? And that's a large part of what I'm trying to do is say, okay, look, yeah, you can look at the world and you can be pretty black pilled about like your own individual potential for success, but there is a path. And what I want to do is, to the people who are looking for that path, make it a little bit clearer. We have a panel coming up. Dimes is this great person in our space. He runs a podcast called Blood Satellite. And in the not so distant future, he's going to have a panel between boomers and zoomers. And the idea is, okay, well, the boomers haven't done a great job of passing the torch, and we can sit around and we can complain about that. Or we could find a way to better facilitate the passing of that torch. Because my good mutual Stormy, and if you've seen, if you're familiar with my content, he's the third episode. He's one of the few episodes behind the paywall. We talk extensively about finance, but one of the points that he makes there is there's a huge amount of resources, but also knowledge, information, and network that's kind of tied up in the boomers. And if you, as a younger person, want to find a path forward, the best place that you're going to find that is making friends with boomers, and building relationships with them and trying to get more involved. And to your point, it's like you were out there, you were grinding, you were making it happen. And I just think a lot of people were kind of bought into the traditional paths of how that worked in the past, but it's not working for them anymore. And so we have to redefine new paths for them to do it.
Right, right. And to be clear, it's also a time commitment thing. Like, I was sacrificing, like, I didn't go out and hang out a lot in high school. I was making businesses. I would hang out with my friends every once in a while, but it would be like, oh, what's Sam doing? He's running a freaking crazy business on YouTube. Or not YouTube, but eBay. Um, and I didn't do any. I was trained for the Marine Corps, and then I left for the Marine Corps, and then in the Marine Corps I started side businesses, and I was working 70 hours a week in the Marine Corps. So it's not like I could do anything. But you shouldn't have to do that, and you shouldn't like. One thing you said though is the traditional route of college, right?
Yeah.
It's I that's not. I know what you mean. I'm not like saying you're wrong, but like I don't think that people realize that the modern public education system was essentially invented in like the 1890s. It changed college over time by the way that like college is different by like the 1920s, 1930s. The same people. I have a whole episode on it. It's one of my older episodes that's not an interview. It really should have been a YouTube video, but I might go back. But I digress. The point is that this like the situation that we have has not been around for very long. Like, college was never a thing that everyone was supposed to go to. When it was a thing that would guarantee you success, only 20% of people went. So it feels like our society was like caught in time in sometime in the 1950s, and then they kept giving the same advice. And part of this, I think, has to do with the homogenization of education. So the homogenization of, and I can't go over the entire episode's contents essentially, but like, I am for destroying the public, the what is it called? The Secretary of Education, the Federal Department of Education. Get rid of it. It was started in the 1970s.
Yeah.
You don't need it.
Yeah.
Okay, so 1500s, 1400s, 1600s, right? Around this time, high and late Middle Ages, and even into the early modern period, 1600s, 1700s, 1500s. You have like the growth of technology and the growth of wealth are both extraordinarily low. So if you're in the 1300s and you grow up in a place, barring some sort of invasion or some sort of natural disaster, you're going to live in a world that's very similar to the one that your grandparents grew up in. So things are going to generally be the same. You're going to
Mm,
learn from your parents, your mentors. You're going to be living in a society where there's different ages of people, and you're going to interact with a bunch of different ages of people. But if you live in a society that the growth rate isn't 2%, it's instead 7%, as the stock market. There's other factors, but the stock market is like 7% historically, and the technology level is increasing at such a rate, then that means that between generations, people's lives are going to change a lot. So when I was getting advice, like I was in high school, I was 17, 18 years old, and I was getting advice from adults, people's in their 30s, 40s, 50s. And my guidance counselor told me, no, go to community college, take math credits, and then go get a STEM degree. That was the advice. That was the real
yeah,
advice. And I'm telling
yeah.
her, like, no, I'm going to join the Marine Corps. These are the benefits I'm going to get. And then after 4 years, I'll get college for free. I'll leave college debt free. I did the exact plan that I told her when I was 17 years old, but she was telling me that that doesn't work. But I did it, and it worked
Mm.
out extremely well for me. It worked out better than I thought. So,
Yeah, and the funny thing is, I always say this a lot, where, you know, the problem with people like guidance counselors is they're supposed to be very good at like helping you find a good job, how helping you network, helping you, build a resume, all of these kinds of things, and you're kind of like, well, if you were good at those things, you probably wouldn't be a guidance counselor. So,
yeah.
like, are they really people you want to be taking advice from? Probably not.
And it's all from this one place. Teachers are the same thing. Teachers are people that 90, 80, 90% of them, and not only am I a Marine, but I'm also a teacher. I got certified, so I can say this. Not that anyone else can't, but like teachers are
Yeah.
dumb. If you look at the
Hmm.
average IQ and average SAT scores, which are related at a macro level, they're directly related. They're the lowest. They're down with like home economics as a college degree. So your teachers, your public school teachers, are the dumbest people that go to college. Yes, they go to college, but I'm telling you, at an IQ level, they are the dumbest people that go to college. They follow a safe conformist route, and then all of the people in our society, 95% of them who go to public school, are then trained by these people. So it's another factor. But the we're living in a time right now that the technology shift has happened so quickly that between like my grandfather is was a Hungarian man who worked in a factory for 40 years, and he raised two kids on or four boys on one income in a segregated neighborhood where he lived with other Catholics. Like that was my grandfather's life. That wasn't my great 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 grandfather's life. That was my grandfather's life. And my dad grew up. My dad's pretty old for me being a millennial. He's in his 70s, but he grew up in this segregated Irish Catholic neighborhood that had some Hungarians and a few Irish, but it was a segregated neighborhood. My dad grew up in a segregated neighborhood, and here I am, like living in a completely different world than my grandfather, speaking a different language than my grandfather, in a different place than my grandfather, because all these things have been normalized, and there's no sense of continuity in the technology, in the culture, in the language. There's no sense of any of these types of things. Do you get the point that I'm saying? Is that
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
the rate of technological growth is so crazy that it's non-arbitrarily different than it was in the past, to the point where the new world that we're growing up in, like parents and guidance counselors have their own problems as being guidance counselors. So do teachers. Like that's a separate issue that's compounding on top of this, which is really bad, and we could fix it a little bit. But even if we fix that problem, there's still the problem that what my dad tells me to do and what my parents wanted me to do is not what would have worked. And all the people that did that, they were like, they heard, let's go to school, go to college, get a 4 year degree. Everybody is telling me that this is what's going to work out. But me being highly disagreeable, I looked at the numbers and I used what other things I learned in school, and not to toot my own horn and talk about how awesome I am, but I didn't do what I was told, and it worked out. Most of the time, people don't do what they're told; it doesn't work out. But the point is their advice is bad, and it's usually not their fault in a big way.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with you, right? I don't think it is their fault because, to your point, right? For the longest time, it was, hey, just do what your dad did, you'll be fine. they were fine. They were able to raise a family, on their income, on their occupation. And yeah, we're definitely not in that world anymore.
Yeah.
Technology is accelerated. To your point, like the economics are different. I mean, there's a whole range of reasons why that is.
And a Big Mac
Um,
is $8 and a gallon of milk is 5. It's insane.
yeah, it's a whole nother world, and I think that that's a big thing for me is a lot of my content. What I'm trying to do is, I was talking to someone about this earlier. Like the left, their problem is they're too delusionally utopian, right? They're trying to create this like subjective, idealized world, and they're not really grounded in reality. The right is trying to go back into tradition, and they're trying to say, hey, this is the way we did it in the past, and so let's just revivify that. But what they don't understand, what the right doesn't understand, is those things need to be adapted to the modern world. And if they're not adapted, they're not going to be effective. And so what we need to do is uh, kind of rescue is in a very like Jordan Peterson kind of sense, like rescue the father from the belly of the whale. We need to capture the natural ideals that made things work in the past, and we need to adapt them to our modern environment. And I don't
Yeah.
think a lot of people are doing that proactively. They're not saying, okay, well, the left is right or the left is wrong, but also the right is wrong. How do we find the actual correct path, this middle ground, this adapted new way of doing things? And I think that's largely what we're trying to do in this space is we're trying to define a new set of ideals, a new path, a new way of doing things that is actually going to be effective. And it's not easy. There's a lot of like pioneering involved in this. There's going to be a lot of trial and error. There's going to be a lot of mistakes, but it's much better than just sitting around and like praying that your 9 to 5 job is going to suddenly be put you in a position where you can raise a family, because that is certainly not going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not. And I mean, you should be able to look at it and be like, okay, what are my paths from here? Some of these 9 to 5 jobs, you can move up in them. But
Mm,
as a reality, a lot of the guys in our space get pretty racial. I tend to not, but when 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 the racial stuff is a reality in the sense that, the Civil Rights Act is our new constitution, and then
mm,
something happens where in 2022 only 6% of those hired at S&P 100 companies are white in a country that's 60% white, non-Hispanic white, then
yep.
I'm looking at that as a non-Hispanic white guy. Or I'm just kidding. Actually, one of my grandfathers was Argentinian. This is a new thing that I might do. So I'm actually Hispanic, um,
Yep.
like Theo Vaughn, and whose dad was Guatemalan. He should be calling it out. But regardless, the point is that it's I started thinking about Theo Vaughn. I lost my train of thought. Look, it's a reality in your life. Like, it's not racist, even. And number one, I don't care if you are racist personally, but if you do care about racism, and you should know that if you're that's a reality that you need to be aware of for your own success. If your plan as a white guy is to try to get in to one of these good colleges, network, and then get a job at a large company, you need to understand that based on who you are as a person, factually, that is more difficult for you, and that needs to be part of your decision making when doing what you're going to do. Like
Mm.
I could go into an institution, but why should I do that? I don't have rich parents who can make me what's it called when you an admissions, a legacy admissions.
Yeah,
If you
legacy. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
if you don't have legacy emissions, you don't have, like, you didn't David Hogg yourself and put yourself out there as, prostrating yourself to the globo homo beliefs, then you're probably not going to get in. It's going to be way harder for you. So look at the paths that are best for you. It's but yeah, that's the thing. I forget why I brought that up, but that is something I like to touch on.
Yeah, no, I think we're talking about this idea of how do you map a practical and effective path forward, right? And this is another topic that I like to touch on a lot. I do like weekly Twitter space on Sunday at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We talk about a range of topics. It's just kind of a way that I can better engage with people and talk about the things that I'm thinking about. And then from a lot of that, sometimes I'll do writings, or I'll invite people on, or it's a great way to network as well. But the more recent one that I did was on what I call toxic tolerance and radical intolerance, right? And the idea is that in our modern world, I think it's a fairly good heuristic to just say everything is an inverted unnatural hierarchy, right? You have this kind of elevation of the wrong people, and this this demoralization of the right people, and it's like, oh, competent is that joke. I'm sure you've seen it. We were talking about it on when I had the Prudentialist on, but like, being on time, and like, like being hardworking and disciplined is like all of this, like, right, well, white supremacist, ideas and stuff like that. And it's like, well, I think the Prudentialist said something hilarious, which was like, hey, look, I'm not a fascist, but like, if you're going to lump me in, like, this is how it's going to be. But, you have to be able to understand that the battle that you're fighting is one where your enemies are going to be aggressive, right? They're going to come push back to you. And if you're, I think we're all inclined as people who like, to get along and, want to see a better world. We're inclined to be friendly. We're inclined to just get along with people. We don't want to cause trouble, and we don't want to make enemies. But at the same time, if you have people who are taking advantage of that tolerance, they're taking advantage of your generosity, and you're losing out because of it, there needs to be a breaking point, right? I think of the guy who subdued the uh, vagrant who was harassing people on the subway.
Right.
It was
Penny.
just like Penny, yeah,
Daniel Penny.
and
Yeah.
yeah, and like, obviously he didn't really do anything wrong. If you actually look into the details of that story, everyone else was kind of fearful for what was going on. The person he subdued had like an insanely long rap sheet of all
Yeah.
of these different like felonies and all of this kind of stuff. And yet he's vilified, right? And I think that people are kind of getting fed up with this. They're kind of getting fed up with being tolerant. They're getting fed up of a judicial system that punishes those who try to stand up and kind of maintain some sense of order. And the question is, okay, how do you deal with that? Right. And I think that's the big question that a lot of us are grappling with. We don't want to paint targets on our back. We don't want to resort to violence, right? Like, that's not what people want to do.
Yeah.
But they're kind of being put in a position where they're asking them, this question is pretty prevalent. It's like, all right, well, when is enough enough? And how do we do things? And, my answer to this has always been, look, go find your people, go, build communities, build relationships, build things that you're proud of, right? Like, orient yourself towards the good, and not define yourself by living in opposition to evil.
Right.
But I also think that we do need to be ready to push against these things, to be willing to say these things, because, if we, it's, again, if you're looking at yourself as like a hero in a story, and that hero is just silent when bad things are happening, like, are you really going to respect that person? No. You need to be able to sacrifice some things to do what is right. And so it's a difficult question, right? It's I'll finish by saying, like, it's that thing where Frodo's talking to Gandalf, and he says, something like, this is the horrible times that we live in. And Gandalf says, of course, everyone wishes they were not born in such times, but the important thing is to understand, how to use the time that we are given. And I think that's kind of what we have to do, is we have to be realistic about the situation. We have to accept the harsh truths that are out there, and then we have to, make the hard decisions. And yeah, it's not going to be easy, but I think that if you think about it, if you reflect, if you are intentional, if you, do all of those things, people might not understand, but you'll know, and God will know. And I think that's the important thing.
Yeah. No, I love that, and I love you bringing Lord of the Rings into it, which of course is, you
Yeah.
know,
Timeless stuff.
yeah, yeah, and that's the point. It's that these texts like this, like Lord of the Rings, written in the early 20th century, and it's before we get Hollywood and all this stuff. But going back to our discussion earlier on,
Mm,
human beings learning through metaphor, and people are not gonna. People used to go to church. People still go to church somewhat, but that used to be
Mm,
like where I'm from in New England. And this culture goes up in a little bit into upstate New York as well. Is that communities were built around these churches, and these were meeting places on Sundays, and this is where you are almost getting entertainment and speaking to people, and that's true of a number of different things. But now when we have these movies and TV shows, and they're created by people who may or may not align with our beliefs. Um, they are these are still metaphors that people use as lenses to view their lives through, and we see this in a literal sense when we look at these neoliberal people who are obsessed with Marvel and view everything through the lens of Harry Potter. But it's with all sorts of movies. Your brain can't tell the difference between a metaphor when it's presented to you through a movie and when it's presented to you through a story like the Iliad. So these effectively become part of the cosmologies and part of the ways that we view the world through. And having something like Lord of the Rings is amazing because there are these beliefs in good and evil and these foundational Western and Anglo ideas. And as an ethnic Celt, it kind of pisses me off. But at the same point, I grew up in America, so that's my culture, and I accept that. Um, so I love it. I love having Lord of the Rings, and I hope one day we will make things like that again. But it's not happening by the mainstream institutions. So to bring up the other thing we were talking about is that we have to build it, and we will.
yeah, I mean, one of the things that I always like to talk about on this idea of like story and understanding through analogy is communication is very difficult, right? Words are relatively low fidelity. I say dog, you understand what I'm talking about, but the vision of the dog in your head is very different than the vision of the dog in my head. And so I think of these more complex ideas like symphonies. There's a lot of notes, there's a lot of musical instruments, there's different tonation, there's movement of the music, all of that kind of stuff. And so communicating a symphony across, one brain to another, it's basically impossible, right? If I try to explain a symphony to you, it'd be very hard to do. But if you had already heard that symphony, I might be able to hum a melody line and you would be able to instantly get it. Or, if you had, if I was trying to describe a band to you that you hadn't heard before, but I said, oh, they're like a mix of you know, like Blink 182 punk meets like techno, something like that, whatever it is, right? Like if I'm able to draw those analogies, you have a better understanding. And I think one of the amazing things, I'm a big fan of Campbell. I'm a big fan of Jung in the sense of the meta structures that they outline. Campbell's The Hero's Journey and Jung's archetypes. And I explain to people like what I love about the hero's journey is, and I think not everyone understands this, is it's basically the blueprint for the most important piece of information that anyone can learn, which is how to solve a problem. Right, you have the young hero who starts out in the ordered small village, right, like that. You think of that as kind of like the ordered world that has certain things figured out,
Like
and
the
he gets the call
Shire.
to adventure. That's the problem. Yes, the Shire, right? The small Tatooine for Luke Skywalker, or the cupboard under the stairs for Harry Potter, or whatever it is. And they get the call to adventure, right? The wise old man gives them some sort of tool, right? That's the past generations handing off the knowledge, and then they go into the unknown, into the chaos, and they look for they try to solve that thing. They look for order. They encounter trials, tribulations. They have to grow stronger. There's the death and rebirth. That's the throwing away of the old framework and the adoption of a new and better framework. And with that, they're able to solve the problem, defeat the great evil, win the treasure, the damsel in distress, and then they come back and they're forever changed, right? And what happened, I think a lot of people understand evolution in a very like biological, like physical sense. They think, oh, we got taller, or we different muscles, or it's like we grew fingers or whatever it is. We also evolved psychologically, right? Because if you think about it, we were passing on this knowledge through story, right, to each generation. And the generations that the people who are better able to pick that problem solving blueprint up from the stories that were being told, they were more effective in the world around them. They were able to better solve things. And so we were like slowly working towards people who are more resonant with understanding stories, the lessons in stories through analogy. So I think it's no surprise in my mind that people really resonate with those stories. They pick up on them. They kind of know, and that's the other thing with Hollywood, right? Is if they're doing a bad job making stories, right? You have a Mary Sue that there's no challenge, there's no adversity. They're subverting all of the tropes to pay so that they can push their message. They're actually breaking from that fundamental structure in such a way that people, whether they understand it or not, it just doesn't feel right because we're so used to that correct version of the story, that correct problem solving arc. And if it's not embodied in the story, it just doesn't resonate.
Right. And there's a lot of things that are like that, right? There's a lot of things that are you try to put these government regulations on them, and you try to change them in a certain way, and then people have to solve the problem of how to go around that, but it becomes an imperfect product based on the people who know what they're trying to create. So if somebody wants to create something and there's some sort of roadblock in front of it, then they're going to create something that is not only, you can never create something perfect in the sense that it is actually perfect and doesn't need to be changed, but you try to get as close to it as possible. And when an external force is preventing you from doing it in the way that you want to, through destroying freedom of association, through regulations that say what you can and can't have a contract with somebody, and you need some of this because you can't have exploitation where people
Yeah.
have like slaves. You just really can't have that. Go ahead and try. That also doesn't create a good situation. It doesn't create a good culture. It creates an exploitative culture, but regardless, that's a different argument. The you're making everything worse. You're forcing everything to be worse, and
Yeah.
there's fat on it. There's fat on it that you have to trim off, and this happens. What I see, to get onto the topic of social constructs, which is something I
Mm.
talk about a lot with governments and with other institutions that are created to serve a specific purpose. They try to be timeless in the sense, you have the idea of monarchy over time, and what if you have a bad king, and there are, like, what they won't teach you in
Yeah.
school is that there are systems for dealing with that, but at the same time sometimes you do get a bad king, and you get a bad king, and the systems don't work to get them out of that position, and bad things happen. But when you create a system like we have, you have the Constitution created, and it's created with specific rules. And then over time, real life happens. And then the Constitution, in theory, becomes the Constitution in practice. And the rules of it are, exhibited in real life, and it changes, and things happen, and then there are amendments made to it, and there's changes in practice, and there's changes in the power structure and the technology of other aspects of life, and then there's these other changes that get added on, and through the theory of what would be called constructivism in political science, but you can apply constructivism to all sorts of things. You create an institution that is bendable but not breakable. You want something that, like a yardstick, that can bend, but it's not going to snap, but you can still mend it a
Yep.
little bit. But eventually you get to the position where there's been so much fat that's been put on to serve some older problem, which is no longer a problem, but it's still, it's still happening because of a change in technology, but it's there and you can't get rid of it without getting rid of something else. Or maybe you
Yeah.
want to put in term limits onto the Senate, which I think is the dumbest thing ever. Not that it wouldn't work, but that it's never going to happen because the incentive structure is not built for term
Yes.
limits to be implemented. So it doesn't
That's a
matter if
big
you,
thing I always
yeah.
say is like, if you want to understand a system, just understand the incentives of the system.
Yeah. A system is what it does, and the system has certain
Yep.
incentives. Why did something happen? And, you can say up and down all you want about how Nancy Pelosi is breaking the law, and then Betty Crocker or whatever can go to prison for it. And then they can, then
Yeah.
there's Fannie Willis, this like small time DA who, yeah, she's corrupt. She stole a few $100,000, but Dan Crenshaw steals that much every day. It's like,
Yeah.
so you look at that and then you realize, oh, it's the incentive structure. She picked on the wrong person, but she's connected to this DA case. And it's just, oh, that's why this is happening. It's not actually because she broke any laws.
Yeah.
But that's a different topic. The point is that the structures, the social constructs, they grow over time away from their original purpose, and eventually you can't change them and they have to be changed. I'm not saying that we have to throw out the Constitution, but I am saying that like this is what happens. It's just what happens over time. You have to have significant reform. That's why no government has the same system of government they had even 100 years ago, much less 500 years ago. And most of them are extraordinarily changed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is what you were talking about earlier with the tectonic plates, right? It's like these little shifts, and then there's this big shift that happens, right? And I think that's where we are, right? Is that the old systems are no longer working. When you say fat, I think over bureaucracy, too much middle management, unnecessary red tape, that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
and it's just creating too much friction in the system, and it's no longer doing what you would want it to do, right? The spirit has been lost. And this is the big thing that I try to tell people is it's not about, like, certainly we need to infiltrate some of these institutions and we just have to start winning them back, but also we need to be building parallel things. We need to be showing people what can be built when they're built on a good foundation that is actually going to work. And
Right.
I think that's a much better path forward than trying to like fix these, because I think a lot of these systems unfortunately are beyond repair.
Right. Right. And so in the past what used to happen when these systems were beyond repair is that there would be a catastrophe and it usually would involve a lot of
Yeah.
death, like, and it would be somebody invading, like there were all these atrophied, I like to use the word atrophy when talking about this. There were these atrophied kingdoms and rulers across Europe and Asia in the when Genghis Khan rolled in, and there's any others of them. But the steppe tribes have this sort of like resetting um, effect where the steppe tribe rolls in and they create a structure for a few generations at best where they do have a leadership over the entire area. They introduce extreme stability. They effectively destroy, in a lot of ways, the old system of government, but they keep certain things that work well to govern it. But they trim the fat off, and obviously it comes with a lot of absolute rape and murder and all this stuff. But
Sure.
that's what happens in human history, right? And the situation, like, they act as a resetting. But what we have since the we've now changed the system so much that we can provide all the calories people need. And we have so much technology in warfare and intelligence that our systems of government aren't really at risk of being destroyed. So they're not going to be destroyed in the sense of like uh, all the the Novgorod Khanate or whatever, which, well, that would have come after any of these institutions that were destroyed by the Huns, any of these kingdoms that are destroyed by the Huns, or like there's unrest in a certain place because they can't function right and they're not providing food to the people, like people are hungry. But until you get to that point, this kind of stuff doesn't happen, especially in a society that has millions of people. And if you want to think of all of the West, it's billions. And since they can provide the necessities with such a small percentage of like what they actually produce, they can use the rest of that money to just work on keeping it going. And um, what I think, unfortunately, what that means is that it's going to take a lot for them to for it to actually be destroyed, because it's going to still take a systematic breakdown, which is stopping people from being able to eat, which is much harder to come by when we have the level of technology that we have. So I don't know. It's probably going to be something completely different than what I think, because it's so complicated and no one ever gets it right when it's this complicated. But we can still guess.
Yeah. I mean, one of the big things that I see in our space is people are starting to talk about building communities, right? Like buying a big piece of land, getting a bunch of people to move there, starting a new infrastructure, new way of doing things. And I think that that's a good goal to have. I think the problem that I've seen with some people trying to make this happen is that they try to do too much too quick. They don't really have the social network yet kind of in place. Like in order to do something like that, you really need to have good bonds between people. They need to have met each other. They need to have a shared ethos. They need to be really committed. You have a lot of people in our space, unfortunately, who they're more on that kind of like NPC level. Like there's NPCs in our own space as well, where they're just kind of here because they're interested in what's going on. They want to adopt these ideas, but they're not going to innovate. They're not going to pioneer themselves. And so the problem becomes if you bring those people in and try to rely on them to help be part of the team, they can be not always the most dependable. Um, so I think really what we're the stage that we're at is the networking stage, the building relationship stage. I think you had mentioned this earlier, right? Like, for me, getting to meet people in person, getting to have conversations, getting to see, what they've done in their lives, right? Like, are they actually competent? Do they take good care of themselves? Are they working out? Are they getting strong? Or are they the basement dwelling, nerds that you kind of, you're kind of like, all right, maybe that was a big thing for me when I first got into this whole thing, right? I had my awakening moment and, I started to see everything for what it was. My initial reaction was like, I don't know if this is true or not. This is what feels right to me. I think this is right, but I don't know yet. And then you start to meet other people who think like you do. And I think you had said this earlier, like, and you realize like they're also pretty successful people. They've got their shit together. They're oriented towards building things. And that is a big white pill for
Yeah.
me, is that a lot of the people in our space, they have their shit together, they're competent, they're driven, they're healthy, they're just everything. They embody the things that we want to be seeing in people, and I think that that is a huge signal that we're on the right track, right? If you were just kind of meeting up with a bunch of dysgenic basement dwelling retards, then you'd be kind of like, nah, maybe this isn't the right space. But
Yeah.
considering it's the opposite, I think that's a great sign. One of the things that I talk to a lot of people about is the idea that we are often disincentivized from seeking power and material success because it's framed as this thing that, oh, if you seek power, then power corrupts, or only greedy people want money. And I think this is a very pernicious and kind of evil way of framing material success, because the way I see it is material success is a pathway to greater spiritual success. If you think of material success as an end in and of itself, then yes, that can be very bad.
Love
But
that.
if you pursue material success as a way to have greater agency and to promote good ideas and to perpetuate that kind of flourishing, I think we mentioned earlier, it was like that's the goal of all life, is to flourish. Then I think that's really healthy, and I want more of our guys to aspire to that. I think you had mentioned this earlier, and I thought it was a really great point. It's like, you have a lot of these people who, unfortunately, the old pathways of, just working a job and being able to raise a family and stuff like that, they're no longer viable. And so people need to expand themselves beyond just those pathways. We need to forge new ways forward. And part of that is being okay, being, cutthroat entrepreneur, right? A lot of the guys who are successful and are making this happen, like you think of like Elon, right? Or you think of like Mark Andreessen or Thiel or the PayPal mafia guys, like they pursued material success, but now they are very much using that to promote greater spiritual success, right? Making the platform more accessible, getting more ideas out, pursuing these things that are, healthy. And yeah, I think that's a big thing for me, is trying to encourage our guys to lean into that. As you pointed out earlier, which I really liked, just like being practical about the reality of the situation that we live in. You're going to have to contend with like the DEI woke hiring crowd. You're going to, if you try to go the natural, the traditional path. And so how do you find a good path forward? I mean, I'm curious to hear what your thoughts on that, and we have I think we could have a good discussion on it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So so much of what I talk about is about the macro side of it. So it's much more about like kind of explaining what is happening, but I also feel that when you understand the macro trends in the right way and you understand how to analyze the world around you, you have a more complete picture of what is happening and how to act in it as a result. I mean, that's
Mm,
another side that I
yeah,
don't generally get into. I mean, I do in these conversations. It's not like the overarching
sure.
idea, but
Yeah.
knowing is half the battle, right? So it's like
Mm,
you have to accurately describe the problem in order to find a solution. And
yep.
I think that
Absolutely.
as individuals, we can do that. But it has to be tied in. It's like, we were talking earlier about like the basement dweller type of person. So somebody could have
Yeah.
like the exact same ideas as I do, but if they're not living them out, it means something different. And the ideas are the
Hmm.
ideas, but if all you're doing is analyzing what's going on around you and you're not doing anything else, then that's great for the content you're creating, but it's not great for you.
Yes.
And also, I think it's important for when you're talking about these types of things to not get too lost in the macro, in the intangible, in these things that you really can't control all that much, rather than just using them to understand your position in the world. And this is the underlying belief of what I don't talk about a lot is the documentary that I'm producing that's about
Mm.
Jimmy Buffett's entrepreneurship. And Jimmy Buffett, through his life, not only through music but through the community surrounding him, he created a billion-dollar company through all these sorts of things, through hotels and restaurants, and created a community which is important for tens of thousands of people. I mean, it's a huge thing, hundreds of thousands across the world. There's an organization that was created like for him by his fans. The
Mm.
Parrot Heads in Paradise is an international organization. They have like dozens of countries. Um, and so a lot of what I like to do is what I studied, what Jimmy Buffett did, which is using the stuff that I'm doing in my personal life. It's using what I'm doing to live the life that I want to live. So not having my work be an end, but having my work be a means in itself. So trying to make money and doing the things that I want to do. And obviously, when you make money, that has to become a consideration that you have. But like, I want to live a life. Like, I mean, I'm already living the life that I want to live, and I just want to use what I'm already doing to allow me to continue to live my life. Like, stuff like the events that I want to go to, like the Parrot Heads convention that I went to, um,
Hmm.
on an expense account, by the way. So I'm paying less taxes because of it. So it's like, yeah, I'm
Yeah.
producing this thing that I want to, and I'm spending money doing it, but I'm using that to then make money. And it's you don't have to be working, like, you can be working a job. I think it's important that you do what you want to do. If you want to work a job, but work a job that you like in a way that's going to also make you successful and fulfilled. And if that means you work a job that you don't really care about, but the rest of the time you're free to do whatever you want, then whatever. That's not what I want to do, but
Yeah.
that's what people can do. Um, yeah, did that even answer your question?
No, I think you're right. Like it's a question of, how do you set yourself up to pursue those higher goals? And for me, this is the other thing that I really try to encourage people to do is be intentional with how they live their lives. Because I think,
Yeah.
and we had talked about this idea a few times where a lot of people just kind of slide into either traditional ways of doing things or they feel social pressure to believe certain ideologies or philosophies or whatever it is. And I think that part of the way that you wake people up to a better way of doing things is to really get them to reflect. Is this the life you want to live? Like, are you going to look back on this and say, yeah, I spent my time wisely. I don't have any regrets. Because I think a lot of people out there, they would feel regret. If they looked back at this point in their life, 20, 30 years from now and say, did I really use that time effectively? And the other thing too is there is a lot of risk in doing that. There's a lot of risk in pursuing those higher things, as you said. It's not every one of us can't like start a podcast and make money off that, right? And so, how do you live a life that aspires to these higher ideals, but also balances everything else that you have to do? You have to be able to provide for yourself, for your family. You have to be able to, get along with people, and that's why I encourage people to become a master of both worlds, right? To understand that you do have to live with one foot in the mainstream delusion, but also one foot in the parallel society. You have to be able to balance that. But the balance comes from understanding, and I loved how you put this earlier, you have to understand the problem before you solve it. This is a big thing for me. When I started actually creating content in the professional sphere, I was writing articles on. I was a recruiter when I first got into tech. Helped build a lot of early stage startups. Recruiting, if it's done well, is very important. I would argue, and maybe self-aggrandizing, but I would argue that recruiting is the most important thing, because the people who are at the business are going to have that's going to be the largest determining factor of whether that business is successful. And so if you bring in the right people, if you do that well, it's very important. And so I started writing a lot of content, around how do you recruit well, how do you think about these things, but also not just from the business perspective, but also from the candidate perspective. Okay, you're a candidate, you want to join a business. Okay, why do you want to be in that business specifically? Why do you want to follow that career path specifically? And a lot of times when I did interviews with people, I would say, okay, what about this business aligns with your goals? Like, what do you want to achieve? How do you think about your work and your life path? And it was amazing to me the degree to which people didn't have a ready answer for that. It's just they hadn't thought, they hadn't reflected. And so I think we need to encourage more people to do that, right? To understand what they want to do. And when you understand that, then you're much more willing and likely to take risks for what you want to do, because you understand that the risk is going to be worth the reward. If it didn't work out, sure, but you're not going to have regrets that you at least didn't take that chance.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And I think it is very important because, I talk a lot about culture on here, and that applies as much to company culture as it does to like broader culture, to
Sure.
broader like
Yeah.
American culture, Western culture, whatever. Um, yeah, dude, there's so much that I want to say, but like we're just gonna have to do this again because like I can't. There
Yeah. No worries.
we could keep going
Yeah.
forever, but yeah, let's do this again.
Sounds good.
All right.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you having me on. It was funny. I saw your post earlier today about like, do you even know that I have a podcast? Or it was like, what was it? It was like, yes, I totally know, and I don't listen, or I do listen. And then the third one was like, what? You have a podcast? I thought that was great.
I encounter that
And
quite a bit, is why I did that. Because the
yeah,
other day it was like a mutual I'd had for months, and I just mentioned the podcast, and they were like, "What, you have a podcast?" And I sent it to them, and then they listened to a bunch of episodes.
yeah,
But yeah, that's a thing. It took me a while. I didn't know Basil had a podcast for a long time.
yeah.
Yeah,
And this is the problem with X that I was talking about earlier. Is it's
exactly.
not great at kind of like promoting the right things, and so you have to promote it in the right way. You have to tell people about it. And that's the other thing too, is I find that when you're creating content, you have to be okay with repeating yourself a lot, right? You're
Yeah,
like, okay, this wasn't a new idea for me, and it was really exciting when I was first learning about it, and I talked about it a lot. But now I'm kind of over it. I've kind of incorporated it. But then you realize, oh, I have listeners, and maybe they haven't heard this idea before, or if I'm like, tweeting around on the timeline or whatever, it's like I should probably mention that I have a podcast and people can go listen
yeah,
to it, or a website. Like when we first got on, you were like, "What? You have a website?" And I was
yeah.
like, "Yeah." It's like it's not for a lack of awareness. It's just the system is not really great at creating visualization, visibility into those things. So
No, it's not. But that's the thing that it does, and it's great as a funnel into other things that are more like that require a larger level of commitment. Um,
yeah, and that's why we got to have these crossovers,
yeah,
and meet other people in the space. It's just like the more collaboration, like my listeners will, I'll promote this on my stuff. My listeners will listen to this, and I always encourage people. It's like if you understand the message, put down the phone and move on. But you should always be moving on, trying to find something that's a little bit new, a little bit fresh. Consider it for yourself. You don't have to believe everything that we're saying here, but I think it's always good to expose yourself to new ideas, new people who have, interesting takes. To your point with the analogy stuff, we all use different analogies to explain maybe even the same ideas. But, there's different analogies that are going to resonate with people in different ways.
yeah, 100%, man. What's the thing you want to promote the most at the tail end of this?
Yeah, so it would be the Substack. I think that if you really want to, follow me on Twitter, subscribe to the Substack. I always appreciate a paid sub, but I know not everyone can do that. So, I try to make a lot of that stuff free. If you want to jump in and listen to the paid content that is behind the wall, just DM me. Like I'll add people's thing to the paid sub. Like I don't mind. I'm not trying to guard that information. It's just more about like, keeping the spicy stuff off the timeline.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But definitely, and I think the other thing that I would really encourage people to do, and I think this is really like a nice little note to end on, is I think a lot of people are a little apprehensive about reaching out to people like yourself, big figures in the space, because they're like, oh, these people are busy, they got their own stuff going on. Like, who am I that I'm like reaching out to them? I've had, like 20 follower accounts reach out to me. And, we've had great conversations in the DMs. When I first met Space Age Maximalist, he's like one of my favorite accounts on Twitter. We were in a random Twitter space with Grill Time. I don't know if you're familiar with his account. He's hilarious. He's great. He runs like a space called NPR every once in a while. Very irreverent, but also very creative. And I met Sam there, Space Age Maximalist, and he had like a couple hundred followers, and we hit it off. And he started a podcast, and I've been on that a few times, and he's been on mine, and like he's one of my favorite people, and so really I think there's a lot of really smart, driven, interesting people on Twitter. Again, I think we're all very nice people. We all, want to be respectful of each other. And so a lot of people kind of, are hesitant to reach out, but definitely reach out to people. Definitely like get yourself involved, create content, do stuff. Like this is a fun and interesting space, and everyone's really open to sharing and talking. And, again, I've met some really amazing people who just randomly reach out to me in the DMs. And, that's how I've built my network as well. Like, I've talked to some accounts that have, 6-figure followers, and it was just a matter of like being a little bit of a reply guy, hitting them up in the DMs.
Yeah.
And then, you talk to these people and you just have great conversations. So, we're building something awesome here. I love what you're doing with the podcast. Really appreciative that you were able to kind of bring me on, and we have this conversation. And for anyone listening, I highly encourage you, get involved. 2024 is the year to build, and we're doing awesome stuff. And the only thing keeping you from being a part of that is your own willingness to kind of reach out and get involved yourself.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, when people DM me, I respond. Sometimes I say more
Yeah.
than they do. Because I'm obsessed with this. So when someone will DM me like a small question, I'll write them like 4 paragraphs. Yeah. All right. So your Substack, I'll drop your link on the Substack when I post this. It'll be up on the Patreon right now. Patreon's $2 a month for me.
You gotta jack up those numbers, man. I'll subscribe, and I'll do like the extra donation or whatever I gotta do.
You don't have to do that, man.
You're making me feel bad. I have I think mine's like $9 a month or something.
Oh,
like
I
that.
mean, I there's not all that much on there, and it's like the other stuff that I do, honestly, it makes me enough money to live. So I'm good. Yeah. Almost like I know I'll start making money off this, but I'm almost good like. Not indefinitely, but like mostly indefinitely. I prefer to put less time to those 2 other things, but it's fine. I make enough money.
But it's always good. I do think that, there's a lot of people out there who want to support, what's going on in the movement here, but they don't have the time themselves to get involved. They're busy with their own lives. And, if they can throw a few bucks to the creators that they think are doing good things, I think it's a great little way to give some energy to the movement.
Yeah. And if you're some whale listening to this and you want to throw me like $2,000 a month and just completely patron me, then there is only a small limit on what I will do for you. Take that as you will. Not you, Basil. Yeah. I know what you're thinking.
I'm gonna be getting a truck and a trailer and traveling the country and doing all that kind of stuff. So
sweet.
That's kind of the next phase. Meeting a lot of people in person. I'm very excited about that. So I do have to buy a truck, and a trailer. So if anyone's like feeling like, hey, I like this meta guy, I like what he's doing, I'm like Bog Beef always says, the patron client relationship, it keeps the wheels turning.
Yeah, I'll be your Donatello. Okay. All right, let's end this here.